Hi, welcome to the Philosophy for the Public workshop. Today is the third talk, Does God Exist Part 2. Last time we promised you that we will be continuing the debate of last time. We'll have the talk first lecture by Professor Robert McIntyre, an assistant professor from the philosophy department. He received his PhD from University of California. Today he's giving us a modern version of the ontological argument. Please welcome him with me.
Okay, thank you. So, can everybody hear me? Yeah? All right. Yeah, okay. I've been told to jam it in my face, then, okay, yeah. Okay. Now, I'd like to discuss an updated, as Yosra said, an updated version of the ontological argument for the existence of God. So I should begin by explaining what an ontological argument is. So an ontological argument for the existence of God is an argument that demonstrates the existence of a perfect being from the mere concept of a perfect being alone. Right? So, in other words, an ontological argument tries to show that God exists from premises that are not based in empirical observation. Rather, the premises of the ontological argument are knowable a priori, that is to say, independently of experiment and experience, right? Or they are necessary truths. Now, an ontological argument is an attempt to show that God exists on the basis of reason alone, right? So on the basis of reason alone. And the modal ontological argument is supposed to show that God exists, or that a perfect being must exist, from the bare possibility that a perfect being might exist. So that is, the argument that I'll present today purports to show that because it is possible that a perfect being exists, a perfect being necessarily exists. Okay? So bear with me. Now, the ontological argument has a long and sort of venerable tradition in the West. St. Anselm, the Bishop of Canterbury, was the first to discover the ontological argument. He gave in Proslogion chapters 2 and 3, it's a book he wrote in the Middle Ages, an argument that purports to show from the mere concept of God that God must exist. And Anselm's proof, sort of compressing this briefly, Anselm's proof works like this. God is that than which no greater can be conceived. Now the atheist, in thinking that God doesn't exist, believes that he can conceive of something greater than that than which no greater can be conceived. But this is impossible, for no one can conceive of something greater than that than which no greater can be conceived. Right? Therefore, this being must exist, because the atheist must be wrong. Right? He is literally thinking something contradictory and inconsistent. Right? So this is Anselm's version of the proof. Shooting forward a couple hundred years, René Descartes revives the argument. Right? So he revives a version of the ontological argument. Now, you can find Descartes' version of the argument in Meditation 5 of the Meditations on First Philosophy. Actually, Descartes gives two proofs for the existence of God in the Meditations. One is in the third meditation, and it's sort of a famously confusing proof, so we're not even going to bother with that one. But the one in the fifth Meditations is actually fairly straightforward. It's a so-called geometrical proof. Right? And it goes something like this. The concept of God is a concept of a being with all possible perfections. But existence is one of the perfections. Therefore, God exists. And Descartes calls it a geometrical proof because you're supposed, by contemplating the idea of God, it is supposed to be obvious to you that he exists in the same way that by contemplating the idea of a triangle, it is obvious to you that the interior angles of a triangle must add to 180 degrees. Right? So these two claims are supposed to be on par. Just like from contemplating the mere idea of a triangle, I can come to the understanding that a triangle necessarily has interior angles that add up to 180 degrees. So too, when I contemplate the idea of God, I understand that necessarily this being exists. So there's that. Now, there are many more philosophers throughout the centuries who have given a version of this proof. Leibniz tries to give a version of this in the New Essays on Human Understanding. And actually, Kurt Gödel, the famous logician, gave a version of the ontological argument sometime in the 50s, I think, sometime around there. So he gives a version of the argument as well. But we're not going to worry about those. Now, many find the argument unsatisfactory. So many find the argument, as I've sort of just really briefly laid it out, unsatisfactory. And there's one very big problem with it. It appears to beg the question, like particularly Descartes' version of the argument, particularly Descartes' version. Why? Well, Descartes says, Anselm's argument doesn't really, it may be that Anselm was smuggling the idea of existence into the idea of the being than which no greater can be conceived, depending on what he means by greatness, of course. But Descartes appears to be nakedly begging the question, because in this premise that existence is one of the perfections, right? So if he says, well, look, God is a being characterized by the following properties: omnipotence, omniscience, existence, etc., etc. Well, of course, the atheist is going to disagree with this characterization of God. He's going to say, well, I don't think God is a being that exists, so God can't be a thing characterized by the property of existence. And you're just begging the question against me if you're defining God as a thing that exists, right? So many people have thought that for this reason and many other reasons, the proof is unsatisfactory, okay? With me so far? All right, good. Now, before I go on to talk about the modal ontological argument, there's some logical stuff you should know, okay? I'm going to try to steer away from some of the technical details, which I think are unnecessary. But there are some logical details that I think you need to know in order to understand the point that I want to make about this proof, okay? The first is that the notion of validity, right? So an argument is valid if and only if it's not possible for the premises of the argument to be true while the conclusion is false, okay? That's just the philosophical definition of validity. It's a logical property of arguments, right? So it's a property of an argument as a whole. I know that in common parlance we say things like, that's a valid point, or that's not a valid point, and we mean something like the person said something false or objectionable or something like this. But in philosophical usage, we have a more narrow, we restrict the term validity to a property of arguments. And it's a property of the form of an argument. So an argument is valid when it has the right kind of form, namely that if you assume the premises are true, then the conclusion is necessarily true, right? So given the truth of the premises, if the argument is valid, then the conclusion necessarily follows, right? That's what the definition of validity is. Now, this has some ramifications for rationality, right? So if an argument is valid, then, since assuming the premises are true, the conclusion must be true, you ought to accept the conclusion of a valid argument if you accept the premises, right? So a valid argument is one such that if the premises are true, the conclusion is necessarily true. And so you are being unreasonable if you accept the premises of a valid argument and yet reject the conclusion, right? Because, as I say, if it's a valid argument, then the conclusion necessarily follows from the premises. So if you accept the premises, you really ought to accept the conclusion on pain of being unreasonable, okay? Now, so therefore, if you want to reject a valid argument, you can't just say, I accept the premises, but I reject the conclusion. That's irrational, right? To reject the conclusion of a valid argument, you have to reject one or more of the premises, right? So if you grant the argument is valid, you must tell the person sort of putting forward the argument, to criticize the argument, you must identify which premise is or premises are false, right? So far, so good? With me? All right. Like I tell my students, think of formal logic like an extremely boring game. You know, these are the rules of the game, okay? So there are some valid rules of inference that you need to know. First, as our good friend modus ponens, right? You're all familiar with this pattern of reasoning. We use it all the time in day-to-day life. We just don't ever use the pretentious Latin name for it, right? So it's the medieval philosophers gave us the name. It literally means something like method of positing, okay? The argument form is this. If you have a statement of the form, if P, then Q, and you have a statement of the form P, you may infer Q. Right? This is one way of thinking about it. You can think about it as a kind of rule of inference, okay? That is, if you have premises of the form, if P then Q, and you have another premise of the form P, you may infer Q, right? And it doesn't matter what P and Q are, okay? It doesn't matter what propositions P and Q are, okay? You can plug in any propositions you like for P and Q, so long as you plug those in consistently. You can infer Q if you've got if P then Q and P, right? Modus ponens, very simple. Let's just give you an English language version of modus ponens. So this is sort of a formal version of modus ponens. It exhibits the structure or the form of the inference. And now here's the form filled in with English, right? If AUC is in Cairo, Cairo, Egypt, that is, then AUC is located in Egypt. But AUC is in Cairo. Therefore, AUC is located in Egypt. So this argument is valid. If you grant the truth of the premises, then you must grant the conclusion, right? You can't deny the conclusion. You can't deny the conclusion of this argument and also accept the two premises. One of your two premises must be false if you want to deny the conclusion of this argument, okay? One of the two premises has to be false because it's a valid argument. It's an instance of a valid form, okay? So, if the premises are true, then necessarily the conclusion follows. Okay? Here's another example for you. If I, Robert McIntyre, am over 2 meters tall, then I am over 1 meter tall. Right? I am over 2 meters tall, therefore I am over 1 meter tall. This is a valid argument. Right? Now, of course, the conclusion is true, right? And the first premise is true, but you might reject the second premise. Right? You might say, well, there's something wrong with this argument because the premise 2 is false. I'm not over 2 meters tall. I'm well below that, right? So this premise is false. But notice that nevertheless, if the premises are true, then the conclusion necessarily follows. So were I actually over 2 meters tall, right, then this conclusion would follow. Right? It would necessarily follow. So far, so good? Okay. Okay, now comes the heavy stuff. So, modal logic is the logic of necessity and possibility. Okay? These are the so-called modes of truth, or the ways in which a proposition can be true. That's why they call it modal logic, right? You have plain vanilla truth, like AUC is located in Cairo, right? You have plain vanilla truth, but then you can also have various flavors of truth beyond the plain vanilla kind. You can say necessarily AUC is in Egypt, right? Or possibly AUC is in Illinois, right? Something like this. You can talk about truths which are true, you can talk about truths which are necessarily true, and you can talk about truths which are possibly true. These are the various modes in which a proposition can be true or false. I've got some examples to sort of make that clearer for you. I also want to introduce the notion of a possible world. Now, a possible world, it sounds like very science fiction, I know, but it's just a picturesque way of talking about the various ways in which the world might have been. So we all recognize that the world is one sort of particular kind of way, but we also recognize that the world might have been a different way if we had made different choices, or if the laws of nature had been different, right? Something like this. So think of a possible world as a complete and consistent alternative history of everything there is, right? It's like a science fiction novel in which every last detail of the universe is recorded, right? And a possible world is just an alternate sort of story of how the universe is, or could have been, or might have been, or even must be, right? So far, so good? So it sounds sci-fi, I know, but it's actually a fairly well-behaved logical notion, actually. We've got a fairly well-behaved logic that sort of studies these kinds of things. Right? So don't worry about the I'm going to keep talking about possible worlds, but a possible world is just a consistent history of everything. Consistency is important, of course. What I mean by consistent is that I'm going to speak of logical possibilities in the broadest sense. This is the sense in which, like, it's possible that I can fly. Right? It's possible that I can fly. Now, of course, that's physically impossible. So if we keep the laws of physics fixed, of course, I cannot fly. That's impossible. Right? But were the laws of physics different, it might be the case that I might fly. Right? It could be. Were the laws of physics different? So we're thinking of, when I speak of a possible world in this context, I'm going to mean possible in the broadest sense, broad logical possibility. And that's why consistency is important, because any possible world, a world will be considered possible so long as it doesn't contain a contradiction. Okay? That's the idea. And that's what I mean by logical possibility. So consistent doesn't contain any hidden contradictions anywhere. Okay? That's the idea. Okay. So now let's define, we can now, using this notion of a possible world, we can define possibility and necessity in the following way. So we can say a proposition is possibly true, if it's true in at least one possible world, right? That is, there's one alternative history of the universe in which the proposition is true, at least one, right? And if you've got an alternative history of the universe in which a proposition is true, then it's possibly true. Now notice that some propositions can be factually false, yet possibly true. So I am not over 2 meters tall, but there's a possible world in which I am 2 meters tall. Right? So we can say it is possible that Robert McIntyre is over 2 meters tall. We recognize this is broadly logically possible. There's nothing logically inconsistent about this. Maybe if my mother had been taller, if my father had been taller, then I would have been taller, something like this, right? But we recognize that it's logically possible that I could be taller than I am in fact. Right? So it's false in the actual world that I'm over 2 meters tall, but it's possibly true that I'm over 2 meters tall because there is a consistent alternative history in which I am 2 meters tall. So far, so good? I've got another example, so we'll go. Okay, now switching over to necessity, a proposition is possibly true if it's true in at least one possible world. A proposition is necessarily true if it is true in every possible world. That is, in any alternative history of the universe, a necessary proposition will come out true. So if you think of all the infinite number of alternate histories of the universe sort of lined up on a bookshelf, the necessary truths are the truths that you will find in every single one of the books, right? In every one of the books you'll find these. So like logical truths you'll find there. Mathematical truths you'll find there, okay? So far so good? Because they come out true in all the possible worlds. I've got a case for you here. So this little blue guy here is going to be the actual world. That's going to be my sort of graphical representation of the actual world. This blue fuzzy thing, neon thing, is the actual world. Now in the actual world, we recognize that it is possible that it snowed in New Cairo today. That is, it is possible that it snowed in New Cairo today. Right? Now it didn't snow in New Cairo today, right? I was just there. It didn't snow in New Cairo today. But it is possible for it to have snowed in New Cairo today. Right? Nothing logically is stopping that from happening. Right? And in fact, I guess I take it that it has snowed there before. So that's, okay, yeah. So it is possible. We know that it's in fact physically possible, right? But it's also logically possible. So according to the possible worlds picture, we're going to have a number of alternative histories. That's what the green glowing dots are. Now, of course, there should be an infinite number of these things, right? Okay? But I can't draw an infinite number of arrows. So I'm just going to have 3, okay? Now, in this possible world, it didn't snow in Cairo today, in New Cairo today, just like in the actual world, right? So in the actual world and this world, it didn't snow in New Cairo. These histories of the universe agree with one another. Right? Over here, same thing. It didn't snow in New Cairo, right? In that possible world either. So in that history of the universe, right, it didn't snow in New Cairo. It didn't snow here, it didn't snow there, it didn't snow there. But over here, in this possible world, you'll note, it did snow in New Cairo here. Right? So in this history of the universe, it did snow in New Cairo. Again, going back to the library metaphor, if you went to the library and you pulled the book off the shelf, you would be able to find at least one book in which this proposition is written, at least one book in which it's true. Okay? Now, because it's true in some alternative history of the universe, it's therefore possibly true in this world that it snowed in New Cairo. Right? So it's true here in the actual world that possibly it snowed in New Cairo, because there's some alternative history of the universe in which it did snow in New Cairo. So far, so good? Now consider this. Necessarily, 2 plus 3 is 5. Necessarily, 2 plus 3 is 5. So let's figure out what this means. So here are all the possible worlds. So when we say in the actual world that 2 plus 3 is necessarily 5, right? So we recognize that this is true. This gets cashed out in possible worlds talk in the following way. To say that necessarily 2 plus 3 is 5 is true, that necessarily this is true, is just to say that 2 and 3 are 5 in every possible world. That is, no matter what book in the library of alternative histories you go to, the proposition 2 plus 3 are 5 comes out true in every one of the books you go to. There is no possible history of the universe in which 2 and 3 make anything other than 5. And now I know there are sophistical proofs where people sometimes say things like, yeah, but if by 2 you mean 5, and by 3 you mean 7, and by plus you mean subtraction, then 2 and 3 don't make 5, right? But no, that's sophistry. That's empty sophistry, okay? If you fix the meaning of 2 to mean this many, and 3 to mean this many, and the addition function to mean just the addition function, okay? There is no possible world in which 2 and 3 make anything other than 5, okay? So I want to put an end to those sophistical schoolboy arguments once and for all, please, okay? So far, so good? You with me? Okay. Oh, yeah, okay, well, that was I'm having fun with the animations, I'm sorry, so. Okay, now, modal logic, just like regular old vanilla logic, is governed by logical principles, okay? Here's where I am glossing over some technical details. So just accept that I am using the system S5. If you're a mathematician, you might know what that means. My proof does rely on that, so I am stipulating this, okay? But anyway, setting that aside, there are 2 modal principles that the proof will rely on. First, modal modus ponens. So just like we had modus ponens in regular old vanilla logic, there is a modus ponens in modal logic as well, called modal modus ponens. Very clever, right? Modal modus ponens has the following form. If it is possible that P, suppose it is possible that P, suppose that necessarily this conditional is true. Now, it's important, by the way, that the necessity applies to the conditional, not to either one of the things inside the conditional. So that's what this comma is meant to indicate, okay? That the scope of the necessarily is over the whole conditional, okay? So if you assume it's possible that P, and you assume that the conditional, if P then Q is necessary, it follows that it's possible that Q is possible. You can kind of intuitively see, but I'll show you a proof in a minute here using my little diagrams, okay? Now another modal principle that I will invoke in this proof is the following, what I'm going to call principle S5. Actually, there are systems weaker than S5 that validate this as an axiom. So, like I think B, does. But, okay, so, doesn't matter. Here's the argument. The form of the argument is this. Suppose it's possible that it's necessary that P, right? Suppose it is possible that it is necessary that P. If it is possible that it is necessary that P, it follows that it is necessary that P, okay? So whatever P is, if it's possible that P is a necessary truth, then it is a necessary truth. That's what this thing says. So if P is possibly a necessary truth, then it is a necessary truth. And I'll give you a proof of that one in a second here. Okay, with me? Okay, here we go. So here's a proof of modal modus ponens. How am I doing on time? Great. Suppose it's possible that P, and suppose that necessarily, if P, then Q, right? So I'm assuming the premises, essentially, of the modal modus ponens argument, okay? So suppose it's possible that P, and suppose that if P, then Q is a necessary truth, okay? Now here are our possible worlds. Now since if P, then Q, we're assuming is a necessary truth, if P then Q comes out true in every one of the alternative histories, right? Because if P then Q is a necessary truth, by the definition of necessarily, if P then Q comes out true in every alternative history of the universe. There is no way, according to this premise, right, of constructing an alternative history of the universe where if P then Q does not come out true. That's just what it means to say if P then Q is necessarily true. Right? So if you assume that if P then Q is a necessary truth, then there is no way to construct a consistent history of the universe where if P then Q doesn't come out true. Okay? Now given that if P then Q is true in every possible universe, and given that possibly P is true, there must be some possible world, therefore, by the definition of possibility, which I have in the handout if you can't, by the definition of possibility, where both if P then Q and P come out true. That is, because necessarily if P then Q is true, if P then Q must be true in all the possible worlds. But because possibly P is true, by the definition of possibility, there must be at least one possible world in which P is true. But then that means that there must be at least one possible world in which both if P then Q and P are true at the same time, right? But in that world, modus ponens apply. Oh, did I just freeze here? What happened? There it is, yeah. But in that world, modus ponens is also a valid rule of argument. and therefore Q is true in that world. Okay? Right? So, since if P then Q is true, and P is true in that possible world, Q must also be true. That's just modus ponens, right? That's just regular old vanilla modus ponens. But since Q is true over here in that world, right? See, there it is, wiggling. See, Q is true over there. By the definition of possibility, possibly P must be true in this world, QED. So there it is. That's the proof, right? So possibly Q must be true in this world, in the actual world, because it was true in one of the possible worlds. Right? It's rock solid. Yes. Yes. Back up. Okay. So because if P then Q is true in all the possible worlds, and because possibly P must be true in at least one of the worlds, there is at least one world in which both the conditional, if P then Q, and P are simultaneously true. But in that world, modus ponens will apply now, and we can infer Q is true in that world. But by the definition of possibility, possibly Q must therefore be true in the actual world. Why? The definition of possibility says that possibly P is true if and only if there is at least one possible world in which P is true. Right? Now, of course, substituting Q for P here, since there is at least one possible world in which Q is true, possibly Q must be true in the actual world. Think of it this way. It's just like the New Cairo example. Right? Why is it true that it's possibly it snowed in New Cairo today? Because even though it didn't, because there is a possible alternative history of the universe in which it did snow in New Cairo. Or if we say something like, it is possible that Hillary Clinton was president. Right? When we say something like that, what we mean is there is an alternative history of the universe in which she was elected and not the other guy. Okay? Right. So far, so good? Okay. Okay, yeah, and so there you go. Now, moving on. Okay, all right, yeah, so I had fun with the animations. Okay, now, to prove principle S5, all right? So now we're going to prove principle S5. Assume it's the case that it's possible that it is necessary that P, right? So I know the iterations of the modal operators gets confusing, but that's as far as the iterations will go here, okay? It is possible that it is necessary that P. Just assume that's true. If it is possible that it is necessary that P, then given the definition of possible, right, there must be at least one possible world in which it is necessary that P. Right? Right? That's just what possibly means. To say that something is possibly true is to say there is an alternative history of the universe in which it comes out true. So to say that it is possible that it is necessary that P is to say that there is some alternative history of the universe in which necessarily P comes out true. But by the definition of necessity, P must be true in all the possible worlds. That's just what it means to say that necessarily P. Right? And so since necessarily P was true in this possible world, it must therefore be P must be true in all of the possible worlds. That's just what necessity means. Right? So when we say necessarily 2 and 3 make 5, what we mean is there is no alternative history of the universe in which 2 and 3 make anything other than 5. Right? So too here. If we say in one of the histories of the universe that necessarily P, right, then we must also mean that there is no alternative history of the universe in which P comes out false. Therefore, in all of the alternative histories of the universe, P comes out true. Yeah? That's the tricky one. I know that's the tricky one. So you with me?
What's the difference between possibly necessary in that sense
Mm-hmm.
and necessary?
There is no difference between them. That is the point. Yeah? That's exactly what this principle proves. That is exactly what the proof shows. Is that if you assume that if we're taking necessity in the broad logical sense, right, then since possibly P entails that P is true in some possible world, and you have possibly necessarily P, it follows that necessarily P, so P is true in all possible world. And so as you rightly say, it's going to follow that in some sense, if you say possibly necessarily P, it's just equivalent to saying necessarily P. Yeah, that's right. That's right. That's exactly what we've just proven. Yeah.
Robert, can you do the same thing again, just real slow?
Okay, yeah. Sorry, I get amped on this stuff, so, okay. Here we go. Now, To say that a proposition is possibly true is to say that there is some alternative history of the universe, some other way the world could have been, in which that proposition comes out true. Okay? But here, of course, we're talking about a special kind of truth. We're talking about a necessary truth. So when we say that there is some necessary, it is possible that some truth is necessary, we mean that there is some possible world in which that necessary truth is true, right? That it's necessarily true in one of these alternative histories. Right? But because by the definition of necessity, so a truth is necessary if it is true in every possible world. Right? So if there is some proposition that's necessary in one possible world, that proposition must be true in all of them. Right? Imagine, just substitute for P any mathematical truth that you don't know yet, right? So suppose it's possible that like some two numbers I've never added together make some other number, okay? Suppose like, x plus y equals z. Suppose it's possible that, x plus y equals z. Well, on the idea that any mathematical truth is necessary, if it's going to be possible that that's true, right, then it's got to be possibly necessarily true. Okay? And so therefore, it's going to be necessarily true in one of the worlds. And so this imaginary mathematical equation will be true in all of the possible worlds. Right? Something like this. Is that a little clearer? We won't worry about the commutation of the two of them. It is possible to do it in some systems. Yeah, I don't think it's going to pose a problem for the proof, however, unless you've got something in mind. But oh. Necessarily, it is possible that P is to show that, well, actually, on the system we're using, any possibility is necessarily possible. Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Don't worry about that, though. It's not going to show up in the proof anywhere. But we're thinking of broad logical possibility. So any truth which is possible is necessarily possible in the sense that there is at least one possible world in which it's true, right? So that means there is no world in which it's not true that it's possibly the case, right? Because there's at least one in which it's true. All the worlds let me put it this way. All the worlds are accessible to one another, is what I'm assuming. So the relationship between these is a reflexive, transitive, and symmetric relationship. So if you've got something that's possible over here, it's also possible over here, and it's possible over there, and it's possible over there. But it might only be true in one of them, right? So if you've got something that's possibly true, it's also going to be necessarily true. But again, the proof doesn't rely on this particular feature of S5. So far, so good? Yes. Yeah.
Can we say that there's nothing necessary to except for mathematics? Because until now, I can imagine a world where I have only one eye or a world where inequality. So the only thing that's necessarily true is the 2 plus 3 example, nothing else.
Well, yeah. Any logical truth will be too. So essentially, what the proof is going. We can come back to this in the question and answer, I suppose. But it's like essentially, what I'm about to show is that a perfect being exists is exactly like 2 plus 3 is 5. Right? It's the same kind of thing. It's a logical truth, right? A metaphysical truth, if you like. Right? I mean, I'm sort of with Charles Hartshorne and Peirce and these guys that, look, when we're talking about metaphysical truths, we're just talking about the structure of logical possibility, right? That's just what we mean. And so, yeah, it would make perfect sense that the mathematical truths and the metaphysical truths sort of coincide in this kind of interesting way. Yeah, they co-populate.
It's only like mathematics or the physical truths, but other than this, nothing necessarily.
That sounds reasonable to me, though. I mean, yeah. Well, logic, yeah. Okay, so logic, yeah, lots of logic. So yeah, like there is no proposition such that that proposition and its negation are simultaneously true. That's somewhat tendentious because there are different logical systems, of course. But yeah, okay, assuming the law of bivalence, then yeah, I mean, certain logical truths are going to turn out to be necessary truths. Yeah, that's right. Okay. All right. So here we go. Now we need to go to the preliminaries on the argument. Plausibly, or let's put it this way, it is extremely intuitively plausible that a perfect being is the sort of being such that if it exists at all, then it necessarily exists. Right? So that if it exists at all, then it must exist. Now notice here, I'm not saying that it does exist. I'm just saying that if that being exists, then it has to exist. It can't not exist. Right? It's a very plausible idea of what a perfect being or a necessary being would be. Right? So we're asking the question, when we ask, does God exist? We're asking, does a kind of necessary being exist? Right? We're asking this question. And one thing that this can mean is that if that thing exists at all, it can't not exist. Right? So if that thing exists at all, then it necessarily exists, right? If it exists at all. So far, so good. So from this, I'm going to devise what I'll call the perfection principle. The perfection principle. Think of the perfection principle as just a conceptual definition of what a necessary being is, or what a perfect being is. Right? So a perfect being is characterized by the following formula. Necessarily, if the perfect being exists, then it necessarily exists. It's important that this necessarily covers the conditional, while this necessarily covers that consequent of the conditional. Okay? So this necessarily governs the if-then part, while this necessarily governs the Q, what would amount to the Q part of the if P then Q statement. Okay? I didn't want to load this up with a lot of symbols, so I had to sort of rely on commas here. But just the comma placing is awkward, but important to make the scope of the necessity operator accurate. Okay? So I'm saying the following conditional is necessary. If a perfect being exists, then it necessarily exists. Right? I'm saying that's a necessary truth because it's just the characterization of what a perfect being is. No perfect being is around unless it's characterized by this principle. Right? I say that's plausible, says I. Now, you could. It's a definition, so you can reject the definition if you want, but then I'm going to ask you to supply a better definition for a perfect being. But we'll come back to this. Now, that's a good song. Okay. So, here's our actual world, all right? Here's our actual world. A blue neon mess. Now, premise one, it is possible that a perfect being exists, right? It is possible that a necessary being exists or a perfect being exists. It's possible that a perfect being exists. I think we grant this as intuitively plausible, right? So it seems, on the face of it, possible that a perfect being exists. Now, necessarily, if a perfect being exists, then it is necessary that a perfect being exists. This is just the perfection principle, after all. Right? That's just what a perfect being is. It's a being characterized by that intuitively plausible definition. Okay? Now, we have our scope of possibilities here. Here are our scope of possibilities. Now, since it's possible that a perfect being exists, there's going to be at least one possible world in which a perfect being exists. Right? That's just what it means to say something is possible. It's to say that there is some alternative history of the universe in which the proposition comes out true. So to say that it's possible that a perfect being exists is just to say that there is some alternative history of the universe in which there is a perfect being. Right? That's just what it is to say that it's possible. Right? Now, since it is necessarily true that if a perfect being exists, a perfect being necessarily exists, that conditional is true in every possible world, right? See? Number two, it says that necessarily this conditional is true. So, in every possible world, that conditional is true in every possible world. Right? But then over here, you can see, by modus ponens, it will follow that it is necessary that a perfect being exists. Right? So in this possible world, where the perfect being does exist, and this conditional, being necessary, is true, it follows by modus ponens that necessarily a perfect being exists. And so it is possible that it is necessary that a perfect being exists. Right? This is just modal modus ponens. Right? We got there using the principle of modal modus ponens, which I just proved is perfectly valid. Right? Now, because it is possibly necessary that a perfect being exists, it follows, there it is there, it follows that a perfect being exists in every possible world, right? It follows that a perfect being exists in every possible world. But if a perfect being exists in every possible world, as it does there with the jiggling signs, it is necessary that a perfect being exists. Right? But Now there it is jiggling again. Sorry, I forgot how many animations I had. But God is just what we call, that God is the name that we conventionally apply to the being that is perfect. Right? God is just our conventional name for the perfect being. Right? And so therefore, God exists. Right? Therefore, God exists. Yeah. Or the perfect being exists anyway. Yeah.
Sorry, which what in the world that it was possible that it doesn't exist or something perfect existed?
Good. Well, okay, I'm going to get right to this point. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's possible if it was in one of the history in the world that it was existed, but which one was it?
Okay. We don't need to specify which one. Right? That's not necessary. All that's necessary is just that so long as you grant that it's possible that a perfect being exists, by the definition of possibility, there's some world. There is at least one world in which it's true this thing exists. That's just what possibly P means, right? It's just that there's some alternative way in which the universe could have been that this is true, that a possible being exists. Just like there's some alternative reality in which Clinton was elected president, right? So too, there's some alternative reality in which a perfect being exists. Now, which alternative reality? It doesn't matter. All we need to know is just that there is at least one. Somewhere in the infinite sea of possibilities, there's at least one where there is a perfect being. That's all that's necessary. Yeah.
I mean, it's not inconsistent.
It is not inconsistent, is all I mean. Yes, it is not inconsistent. Yeah. Possible worlds talk is just a picturesque way of talking. Yeah. But doing it this way avoids symbols, yeah, which is the point.
You say that possibly Hillary Clinton was president. Will it not lead you to the fact that Hillary Clinton is the president?
No, because by possibly here we mean something like had the results gone a different way, then she would have been president. He's right. Just think of it this way: it's logically consistent that Clinton were president. Right? There's no logical incoherence there, is the idea. Now, of course, to make it the case that she was president, you'd have to change a bunch of facts, right? But that's why we talk about alternative possible histories. And so you just write the history differently, and then she is president there. I mean, there's an alternative history in which Lincoln wasn't assassinated and that kind of stuff, right? Yeah, I mean, historical fictions are all about that kind of thing.
How about we change the whole argument? It is possible that no perfect
Yes. So that's exactly what I want to get to right now. There are limitations on the argument. So here are some reflections for you. Right? The argument is valid. So the argument is certainly valid. Right? It doesn't show that any particular religion is correct. Right? So, I mean, again, it's just meant to show that there must be that something necessarily exists. Right? That's what it shows. Something necessarily exists. So it doesn't show any particular religion is correct. It doesn't show that there's any kind of God that's sort of a personal kind of God or anything like this. But, it does show that something must necessarily exist. And that's kind of an important and interesting truth, right? Or an interesting sort of, let's put it this way. It's an interesting result. Now, as Leibniz pointed out, this is Leibniz here in his smashing wig, right? So the proof is not, strictly speaking, demonstrative, right? It is not, strictly speaking, demonstrative. Now, why? Because we don't have a proof that the concept of a perfect being is logically consistent. Without a proof that the concept of a perfect being is logically consistent, we do not have a fully demonstrative proof that God exists, right? And this is what Leibniz pointed out. And now Leibniz tried to supply the consistency proof, but it's widely regarded as a failure, right? He didn't quite get there. On the other hand, though, what the argument shows is that if you accept the premises of this argument, that is, if the notion of a perfect being is not inconsistent, then the perfect being necessarily exists. So since the argument is valid, if you grant the premises, you must grant the conclusion on pain of being irrational. So it does show that, yes, if the perfect being is possible, then the perfect being necessarily exists. Right? Now that's something, it seems to me, because what we have learned here is that either God exists or else God cannot exist. Since the argument is valid, what we have is that either a perfect being does exist or a perfect, and necessarily so, or a perfect being cannot exist, and there's some sort of logical inconsistency in the very concept of a perfect being. And so the atheist can't simply argue, the atheist now can't simply argue that God doesn't exist, but he might exist. The atheist has to meet a higher bar than this, actually. Since there's a as Leibniz puts it, the presumption is on the side of the possible. The presumption is on the side of the possible. And so unless you can show that there is a logical inconsistency in the very notion, we are allowed to at least entertain as a possibility that this thing is consistent. The burden of proof, then, is on the atheist, it seems to me, in light of this proof. He can't simply argue that God doesn't exist. He must show that God is impossible. Right? And that's a very high bar to meet. It also might rule out certain kinds of what looked like pretty good atheistic arguments. So one atheistic type argument is the so-called evidential problem of evil. And in the evidential problem of evil, you don't try to show that there's some sort of logical inconsistency between God's benevolence and the existence of evil, because there are arguments to show there is no logical inconsistency there. Rather, the evidential problem tries to say something like this. All of the evil, there appears to be a lot of pointless pain and suffering in the universe. Given that this pain and suffering we see appears very pointless, it is highly likely that God doesn't exist. Now, that kind of argument doesn't fly in light of this proof. Since this proof is valid, the atheist can't say it's highly unlikely that God doesn't exist, right? If you understand highly unlikely as sort of countenancing the possibility that the God does exist. He must say instead that it is impossible that God exists. And as I say, that's a very high bar to meet. On the one hand, disappointing because we don't have a demonstrative proof. On the other hand, we have learned something I think pretty interesting and important about the notion of a perfect being. Namely that you can't, if you admit the thing is possible, you have admitted that it exists, if you admit that it's possible. So, the atheist must show that it is not possible for God to exist. That's the end of my talk. So,
I just want to change the word. You must show God is not need, not impossible, and make it a high bar. What's the name of the British guy in the green chair?
Hawking. Stephen Hawking.
Yeah, Stephen wrote an article that said you don't need God to explain the universe.
Yeah, sure.
And that, to me, you will make it impossible or a high bar, total participation.
Actually, I'm not sure that Stephen Hawking's point touches the proof. Because this isn't so the kind of argument, so Hawking has in mind invoking God as an explanatory principle, right? But that's an empirical style argument. It's an empirical argument, because what you're saying is that we cannot explain the happenings in the physical universe without positing the existence of a perfect being to sort of kick it off, like a creator. But this is something somewhat like the watchmaker analogy, or it's a bit like sort of one of Aquinas' 5 ways, that kind of thing. Or the cosmological argument is an argument somewhat like this. But those are considered a posteriori arguments in the sense that they rely on the assumption of physical facts. This is a purely a priori argument, and it's meant to be sort of a mathematical argument about, mathematical in the broad sense, argument about the concept of a perfect being. So it isn't, in no way do I need to talk about the God as a creator, for example. Like, there's another limitation on the proof. I haven't shown that a creator God exists, right? Again, all that this argument would show is that some necessary being exists if it's possible that a necessary being exists. That's all that it shows. Now, I still think that that's a pretty impressive a priori result, that you can show that if this thing is possible, then it must exist. But again, we would need to have some sort of discussion of, like, what perfections are, what kind of conditions apply to a necessary being, and that kind of thing. I mean, that's metaphysics, but you're right. I mean, I haven't said anything about a creator God or a loving God or anything like this. So it's an interesting intellectual result, but maybe doesn't have a lot of religious pull to it that you might want or something like this. I mean, that certainly seems right. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, by perfection, look, I don't actually think I need to talk about perfection to make this proof work. I think I can just talk about a necessary being. And I think the proof will be valid anyway. But they always couch it in terms of perfection. And they think about like, the most beingly thing, the thing that is in the highest possible degree, right? That kind of, that's the idea. Perfection, one problem is that a lot of this is the discussion of the terminology derives a lot from highly religiously loaded discussions from the Middle Ages, right? So of course we have to talk about a perfect being, a most high being, et cetera, which is plausible. When we're talking about a necessary being, this is all very plausible, it seems to me. But we can say something like, just if you're worried about the term perfection, take it out. And we'll just say something like, a necessary being is one such that if it exists, then it can't not exist, right? And if you grant that, then you still have, the proof still goes through. And then you show that something necessarily exists. Now, again, this goes back to the point I was just making in response to the gentleman's question, that what we need is some kind of analysis of the notion of a necessary being, and then this is where we start talking about the so-called logic of perfection, right? That kind of thing. A different project, as I see it. Yosra, you want to say something? Sorry, Yosra up front here. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, say it a little louder.
There's one thing that confuses me. The idea of a perfect being
Uh-huh.
that can exist, cannot not exist.
Yes.
Why is a perfect being cannot not exist?
Well, look, so that's why we can take away perfection if this is the term that bothers you. And we'll just say something like a necessary being. And now we're asking the question in this proof, does a necessary being exist? And now the proof shows that if it's possible that there's a necessary being, then there is a necessary being. And so when we talk about, so take out perfection, and now by a necessary being we mean one such that if it exists at all, it necessarily exists. That strikes me as a fairly clear tautology, actually. Yeah, it's a tautology. If it exists at all, then it necessarily exists. Now, I'm not assuming that it exists, though, so it isn't begging the question. Because I'm not saying, for example, that if it exists, then it exists. I'm not saying that. I'm saying, rather, if it exists, then necessarily it does. So if it exists at all, then it is characterized by necessary existence. That itself is not a tautological claim in the sense that if it exists, then it exists, right? It's a substantive claim. But it is at least like a very intuitively plausible claim about what it means to say a necessary being exists. Right? It can't not exist if it does exist. Right? It can't not exist if it does exist. Otherwise, how is it a necessary being? That's the idea.
The question is that it's just based on the idea of necessity of
Yeah.
existence.
Yeah.
So God would be just the necessity of existence.
Okay, so
God would be nothing else.
again, limitation on the argument. One possible interpretation of the argument is that it shows that, in some sense, existence is necessary, right? That like there can't not be something that exists. Again, this is a very interesting result, if true, right? That all the possible worlds are populated by something, right? I mean, that's an interesting result too. So you're right, again, it doesn't show that there's an anthropomorphic deity, there doesn't show that there's like a sort of a deity that created the universe and steers the universe, et cetera, et cetera. One small step at a time. Rome wasn't built in a day, as they say, right? Yes, gentleman here.
So if we say that the existence of a perfect being cannot exist, or a perfect being cannot exist, or its existence actually contradicts itself,
Yep.
do we put that into the argument? Can we say that God doesn't exist?
Yes, so, since it's a valid argument, one man's modus ponens is another man's modus tollens, as they say. Right? So a modus ponens argument goes, if P then Q, P therefore Q. A modus tollens argument goes, not Q, therefore not P, right, using the same premises. That's why I'm saying, if you want to reject the conclusion of the argument, you must reject one of the premises. And the one that looks like the most open to rejection is the first one. And so you'd have to say something like, a perfect being doesn't exist, but you can't just say that. You have to say a perfect being cannot exist. That's exactly right. So again, the atheist has to meet that bar, that the perfect being cannot exist. Right? Although you can't say that he might exist, because if you say he might exist, he does. Mhm.
Does the word not is not needed to
Mhm.
exist? Could that be an accepted, premise?
Um,
If I may add, I want to be very brief.
Mhm.
Right? The universe is really empty, and there's a black star.
Mhm.
Everything passes through the black star, gets sucked up. So now a conclusion could be that it's a mirror universe because it gets sucked up
Mhm.
and went to the outside,
Mhm.
exact mirror
Mhm.
image.
Mhm.
So that is plausible. And it's been like 6 billion years, and they found the universe is expanding.
yes.
They guess 1 more billion becomes 7, and then will start shrinking.
Yeah.
And when it shrinks to from the Big Bang to nothing,
Yeah, you're thinking a cyclical universe, and yeah.
that's about 14 billion years, already 6 passed, and then that's presumably the old judgment.
I mean, so yeah, I mean, again, this invokes the idea of needing God as an explanatory principle, right? What this argument, as I see it, is perfectly consistent with the argument you just sort of laid out here, because again, I mean, I've shown that this argument would show that something necessarily exists. I haven't said what that something is, right? And so, as I see it, it's perfectly complementary with this sort of view of the universe as a necessary being in and of itself, right? I mean, maybe that's what, I mean, people have argued something like this. Again, I mean, I take it that that's just a limitation on the proof, that I'm not trying to show that there's a creator God. I'm not trying to show that there's a God of a particular religion or that the God is an explanatory principle. We're showing that as an a priori truth, right, something must exist. That's the idea. Yes, the gentleman in here. Mm-hmm.
I admit that the MMP argument is true, but I don't see why the believer can only rely on the possibility of existence of God and then put inside rule that if he exists and he must exist, and we can take it the other way without proving, without rejecting the first premise. What if we rely on the possibility itself, that the God is possibly does not possibly exist? And second premise is if he doesn't exist, then he doesn't exist at all, and in one of the world he doesn't exist, and by necessity then he doesn't exist. Then the argument gives us two opposing results. So the argument itself is not true, not because of one of the premises, but because of one of the results of one of the arguments is opposing the other.
Well, actually, it just sounds like what you're doing is, if I follow you correctly, it sounds like you're pointing out that if we reject one of the premises, you can infer the opposite conclusion, right? That if you tweak one of the premises, you infer the opposite conclusion, that God can't exist. Right? Yeah, you're right. I mean, so this would be the atheistic modal ontological argument, right? Or anti-modal ontological argument or something. And it would be, it would be valid. Yes, that's right. It would be valid. And so this is why, again, I mean, I say what we have, the sort of interesting philosophical upshot that we get out of this argument is that, because of course, again, I point out I haven't demonstrated that a necessary being exists because I haven't proven that the concept of a necessary being is coherent, right? But what I have shown, though, is that the atheist can't demonstrate that God does not exist without giving me a corresponding demonstration that God cannot exist. Right? So it's sort of, that's how I see, and as I sort of agree with Leibniz, that there's a presumption on the side of the possible, right? That I don't see any inherent contradiction here. Right? And so if the guy, the other guy says that there is a logical contradiction, maybe he should show me because it seems plausible that there isn't one. Yeah. Yeah.
So when you say that for something to be possible, possibilities and learn the history of everything.
Yeah.
So this means that literally everything is possible. There's nothing impossible, right?
Well, no, because some logical contradictions, for example, anything that doesn't contain a contradiction is possible. Right? That's why this is the point that the atheist has to show that the concept of God is incoherent. I'm saying the atheist, but like if you want to say a necessary being doesn't exist, you have to show that it can't exist, is what I'm saying. Right?
What I'm saying is that based on this definition, I can't think of anything that's completely impossible.
Square circles. That's the one. So think of the circle that is square simultaneously. So it's a figure whose sides are all equidistant from a center point and that has 4 right angles.
Yeah, but this takes us back to mathematics and geometry.
Sure, because logical truths and mathematical truths are of the same sort of ilk, right? They are a priori truths. Yeah, I mean, that's right. I mean, so yeah, I mean, no, like when we think of contingent truths, we're thinking of like physical facts or something like this, or biological facts. They're contingent because, you know, had the laws of nature been different than they in fact are, you know, human biology would be different than it is, therefore, et cetera. You're right, but you know, the logical truths aren't like that, right? They are a priori, and so it seems like they're all either necessarily true or they're all either necessarily false, right? That kind of thing. Not all of them, I guess. We're thinking tautology is what I have in mind. Yeah.
Yeah, about the second proposition, which I personally find the most unacceptable.
You talking about this one?
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
But is there any philosopher who objected to the idea of giving an attribute to something before you even know it exists?
Yes, so one of the sort of Kantian types of responses to the ontological argument is this, it's often put in a loose sort of way that existence isn't a property that can characterize anything, right? Frege put it this way, a little bit better, is that existence isn't a first order property, it's a second order property. So it's not a property of objects, it's a property of properties. So when we say something like, you know, I don't know, green apples exist or something like that. Green is a property of the apples, existence is a property of being a green apple, right? That's the Fregean point. And then that sort of argument applies, I think, to the, Anselmian type arguments and the Descartes argument. So Anselm's argument and Descartes' argument. But I don't think this argument relies on the idea of existence being a kind of predicate, because all we have to do is just say something like, there is a being such that, so let perfection be sort of symbolized as P. We say something like, necessarily, there is an X such that Px, then necessarily there is an X such that Px, right? So now we're not using existence as a predicate there, we're using perfection as the predicate. And we're characterizing necessary existence in this propositional way, not in the sort of predicative way. That's the idea. Yeah. Uh-huh.
So I don't think I really understand the argument.
Uh-huh.
Something that may exist, like aliens with orange eyes.
Uh-huh.
And I ask you to prove that they don't exist.
Mhm.
I think it's classified as Russell's argument.
It's what argument?
Russell's argument.
Oh, yeah. So you're thinking the Russellian thing where, you know, Russell says, look, it's not the job of the skeptic to disprove the believer or something like this because the believer is putting forward the positive claim. Right. But the thing with burden of proof is that burden of proof shifts. So now if I provide you with a prima facie argument in favor of the claim that I'm making, the burden of proof shifts now from me to you. And so in light of a prima facie argument to the conclusion that a perfect being exists, it does now fall on the other guy, if they're going to maintain that it doesn't, to tell me which premise is false. Because I've provided the prima facie argument for it. So Russell is right. You know, if the theist just sort of stamps his foot and says God exists, give me a proof that he doesn't, that's illogical. That's a bad dialectical move. It's a bad dialectical move, right? But that's not what's going on here, right? You know, if Russell says, supply me the proof that there is a necessary being, I say, okay, Russell, there you go. There's a proof, there's a necessary being. Now what? Right? Like that's the dialectic as I see it. So now Russell does have to come back and give me some sort of argument that this thing can't exist. Now, of course, as was pointed out here, you can form the following conditional is true in light of the fact that this is a valid argument. If it's possible a necessary being exists, then a necessary being does exist. However, we can just flip that around. If a necessary being does not exist, then it's impossible for a necessary being to exist. And that would be the atheist position. So what I'm saying is that you know, you would have to supply the consistency proof that the concept is coherent. But what I'm suggesting, though, is that in light of this argument, the atheist, here's what I take to be, I want to make a very, very small logical contribution to the debate. And that's this. An atheist cannot admit that it is possible that God exists and say that he doesn't exist. Because if God is defined as a perfect being necessarily exists, or a necessary being, exists, right? So the atheist can't simply maintain that God might exist but doesn't. He has to maintain something stronger, right? That it's impossible.
The believer has to maintain that God must exist.
But that's okay, because all they have to show is just that it's possible God exists. That's a significantly lower bar to meet than showing that something cannot exist, it seems to me. Mm-hmm. Yep.
Try again
Mm-hmm.
my argument before. You say that, okay, that's true that, it's not the existence which is the predicate.
Yeah.
It's even worse because it's necessity.
Necessity would be an operator here, not a, yeah.
It's supposed to be, but now
Yeah.
it becomes perfection includes necessity somehow.
Well, I haven't included necessity in the predicate itself. I'm saying that the following definition applies to a perfect being, that if it exists at all, it necessarily exists. Now, I haven't packed existence into the definition there. I've said the following truth characterizes that being. If it exists at all. If it exists at all. That's the key part there. I'm not assuming it does exist. I'm saying that if it exists, then it exists necessarily. And so if I show that it's possible the thing exists, then it does. I don't think it's a predicate. So as I understand this,
Or a predicate applied to a certain property, then it implies another predicate. I mean, this is not only one.
that's the grammatical structure. Necessarily, this thing. Right? So this is the necessity operator. This is the existential quantifier. And there's our perfection predicate. Now I can say this thing is anything you like. I don't care what property this is. This could be anything you like. Okay. The point is that if this is a truth, if you accept this as a truth, whatever that thing is, right, then it follows that this thing necessarily exists. Something is characterized by this. I mean, think of it this way. Like again, I go back to the point that the proof is limited because it doesn't show that there's a specific religious tradition is true or something like that. And as I pointed out over here, I would say at most what I'm willing to say is that it shows that something exists necessarily, right? Something exists necessarily. That's actually what that would say. Take any predicate you like, right? Or, let P be whatever you want, okay? Or just some arbitrary predicate, let's say. There is something that instantiates this predicate, right, is the idea. So think of it this way. Some property is instantiated, right, necessarily, which is equivalent to saying that, in the Fregean terms, that's equivalent to saying of the first order property, some first order property has an instance necessarily. Some first order property must have an instance necessarily. And then now I'm not using existence as a first order predicate, I'm using it as a second order predicate. And so we've avoided the Kantian problem.
So if the word perfect absolutely,
so I think this is a tricky point in the argument. And I'm not really sure what I want to say about this because every presentation of the argument involves perfection. They always talk about perfection. I'm not sure you need that. I don't think you need it at all. But I'm willing to say that I'm willing to admit that the argument proves much less than some theists want to say that it proves. And so it proves only, if since it's valid, and it proves only that something necessarily exists. Yeah, something necessarily exists. Yeah, that it can't not exist. Yeah, something can't not exist. And so in answer to the famous Heideggerian question, why is there something instead of nothing, right? The answer is, there must be something. Yeah, there must be something. You're right. So we are far from a traditional sort of concept of God. But look, we are talking about what human reason can accomplish on its own, unaided, et cetera, et cetera. And so, like, this is one step in a larger metaphysical project, right? I mean, science, if we go to the physicist doesn't try to prove some sort of cosmological, grand cosmological scheme from like one argument here, one argument there. Like, why should the metaphysician do the same? I mean, why do metaphysical arguments have to be held to a different standard than that? And it seems acceptable to me that we have little piecemeal metaphysical arguments that build to a larger picture over time. And this, I take it, is just one small step in a larger project. Mm-hmm.
I want to add and help my friend.
Yeah.
Let's bring it down. By the way, we ought to have a mic moving around.
Oh, Yasra, do you want to?
The question was
Yeah.
let's bring it down to every community had a small community gathering. They had their own god.
Mm-hmm.
They found them stealing, raping, killing. So somebody says to them, don't do that.
Mm-hmm.
You're going to go to hell and scare the hell out of them,
Yeah.
And then say, if you are good, you're going to go to this wonderful place where I jokingly say, the Muslim says you're going to have 72 virgins. Then I say, after 52 weeks, they all will not be virgins. So then I heard, no, to regenerate itself. So that is why you have so many religions. It's out of necessity. So to try to say you need a perfect thing. No, actually, why there's so many religions, and I studied under Dr. Clough, who's in Montana now, comparative religion.
Yeah.
Everybody speaks about Abrahamic religion, and there is a woman in Stanford who said, this is crazy, the Abrahamic religions, he didn't even ask God, spare my kid. He accepted it.
Yeah.
And that's the reason for all the problems.
Well, yeah.
And people here don't know there's philosophy, there's Buddhism, Shintoism, and zillion religions.
Yeah.
So I think religion is an invention of the time and the community. And in the old days, the crazy stuff, the Jews, etc., used to say, I'm not against Jews, by the way, they're very smart. No, but they used to say the woman has to go to the temple when she has a period. And the period is a very logical thing. And in Africa, they say when the woman has a period, all the women has to go to a certain tent or whatever. But then they're having fun. Say, I'm glad I don't have to clean and cook and do all that, and they're making fun of their husbands. So anyway, and religions, all of them are really books about sex. But they say, don't do that, don't do that, don't do that, do that, do that. Anyway, thank you.
Well, yeah, sure, well, thank you. Yeah, I mean, again, I guess I should clear up necessarily here. I mean, the sense of necessity you're speaking of, again, is sort of pragmatic necessity, right? So to kind of deal with our existential angst and with sort of the, that kind of thing, and to try to explain the phenomena around us, human beings start to posit pantheons of gods and that kind of thing. The necessity I'm speaking of here is logical necessity. So this is a matter not of pragmatic necessity of like what's useful for us and what we need to help us in our lives. And it's not a matter of explanatory necessity, as in I need to posit this thing in order to explain some phenomena. Rather, this is necessity in, as was pointed out again, necessity in the mathematical sense, that it's necessary in the same sense in which 2 plus 3 is 5 is necessary, right? A priori kind of necessary, mathematical necessity. And again, I point out that yes, there's a limitation on the proof in that it doesn't show any particular kind of religious doctrine or religious practice is the correct one. And so what I've said here is compatible with the Bhagavad Gita's too, right? I mean, it's compatible with all of that. It just says, something necessarily exists. Whether that's a Godhead with many different, aspects, or whether that's, one and only one creator God or something like this, it's just beyond the scope of what I intend to prove. That's just beyond the scope of the argument. Yes, please. Give this young lady here.
But actually, in our world, Trump is the president. In
Yeah.
our world,
Yes.
it's possible there is no God in our world.
Are you
Do you
saying those two things are connected?
No. You said that in a possible world there is a God.
Uh-huh.
In our world, it must be a God.
Yep.
Do you understand me?
Yes,
In our world, Trump is the president.
yes,
In a possible world, Clinton is the president.
Yes.
But in our world, Trump is the president.
yes. Yeah, so that's because a truth like Donald Trump is the president is a contingent truth, right? So it's true in the actual world, it's true in some of the other possible worlds, but it's also false in some of the other possible worlds because we recognize it's contingent. So there are some worlds in which he didn't win. There are other worlds like our own in which he did win, right? But there are other ones where somebody else won. There are worlds in which third-party candidates won, that kind of thing.
I mean that our world it must not have a God. Like Clinton, do you understand? Not madam.
Well, the argument is precisely supposed to show that given that that in some possible world a necessary being exists, a necessary being must exist in this world too. In our world, yeah.
In our, it
Yes,
must exist?
Yes, because our world is one of the possible worlds. So our world is one of the, here it is, so it must be possible. So our world is one of the possible worlds. And so if it's true that this thing exists in one of the other possible worlds, since it's necessarily true, it has to be true in all of the possible worlds, including this one. Now, that's different from the Clinton example because that's a merely contingent truth. It's a possible truth, but it's not a necessary truth. It's contingent. It can be true, but it could be false. The kind of thing I'm talking about is one which cannot be false. So it can't be false that there is a necessary being if you grant that it is possible that there is a necessary being.
Or until he gets impeached soon, I hope. So it doesn't have to be
I make no determination. Actually, let's get this guy up front here. The mic's closer. So. And then we can pass it to the guy in the back there. Mm-hmm. You might have to come forward, actually, if you're going to do that.
If we accept this philosophical technique as it is and just a step behind, okay, we accept it. So I have two questions.
Mm-hmm.
First one for the supporters of this argument.
Yes.
What's the next step that they would be taking? Okay, there is a perfect being. Okay.
Yep.
So what? That's the first one. And the second one, what's the defense of the atheist team?
What do they say?
They accepted it, and just like that. In real life. Okay, when they are presented with this argument, what do they do?
Well, they usually gnash their teeth and pull out their hair and cry. No, but they after a while they concede it's valid. I mean, if they know their modal logic and they know that these two principles I'm using here are just principles of modal logic, they concede. And so this is how the literature sort of has. I mean, basically the literature on this topic has sort of come to a standstill because everybody has sort of realized that this is a valid argument, and now it's up to the atheist to show that that God is an impossible thing. I mean, that's where the atheist does sort of stand, it seems to me. They have to either find something wrong, so either they have to deny the argument is valid or...
In real life, there's nothing... I'm just saying about in real life and the history of philosophy.
Yep.
No one countered this argument with any other argument.
There are some... So there is... I didn't talk about this particular objection to the ontological argument because it's kind of confusing, and it would have taken me longer than an hour but I'll do it anyway.
No problem.
There's the Gaunilo, was a monk at the same time Anselm was writing. And Gaunilo said, look, I don't know what's wrong with the argument, but I know something's wrong with the argument because using what seems to be the same logic as your argument, Anselm, I can show that a perfect island exists, right? That an island than which no greater island can be conceived exists, right? So people have, now actually I think that there's a perfectly good answer to that one on Anselm's behalf. It's that perfections are supposed to be like maximal kinds of properties, things of which you can have the maximum of. Like, so omnipotence, you can be maximally wise, or omniscience, you can be maximally powerful, right? But being a perfect island doesn't seem like the kind of thing that has a maximum to it. Take any island that's got a plethora of coconuts and lots of sunshine, right? And plenty of delicious food to eat. Okay, add one more coconut to it. Now I've got a slightly more perfect island, right? Add another coconut to it. Now I got a better island than that one, right? And so it seems like island perfection properties are not properties that have a logical maximum to them, right? And I think that's the right answer. So yes, it is. I can always conceive of an island greater than the island you're thinking of. I can always add one more dancing girl, one more coconut, right? That sort of thing. Right? Now,
what about the supporters of this argument? How did they take it further?
Right. So now, this argument appears to have a similar sort of Gaunilo-style objection to it, which would show that if the Gaunilo-style objection is valid, then it would show that not just one perfect being or necessary being exists, but a whole pantheon of necessary beings exist. Pantheon of necessary beings exist. Now, that's why I wanted to sort of give a more minimal kind of characterization of perfection here. I don't want to entail that like only one perfect thing exists, for example. Then this is where you're asking now, where do they go from here? Fleshing out the logic of perfection is the way to do it. So, you want to join this proof up with the proof that the necessary being is an omnipotent being, and that seems plausible. You want to join, and if you can show that the necessary being is an omnipotent being, there's a very quick proof to show there can only be one, right? Because if you have more than one omnipotent being, the omnipotent being A can prevent omnipotent being B from doing anything, but like he also can't prevent him from doing those things because omnipotent being B can stop omnipotent being A from stopping him from doing these things. So you have a logical contradiction. So there can only be at most one omnipotent being, and so there's a nice. I mean, obviously more needs to be said, but this is one sort of step in the direction that people sort of talk about now, is that, okay, if there's a necessary being, what kinds of properties does this thing have to have? Omnipotence is a plausible one. Okay, well now if it is an omnipotent thing, then it would be something such that there can only be one of it, right? There can't be more than one omnipotent thing. It's baby steps, but that's to say it's natural theology, right? It's human reason. So. What country? Gaunilo is Italian, I think. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Around 1100, somewhere around there. So this were Middle Ages. So the same time period as Anselm. Yeah. I wish Dr. Balo were here. She could answer that perfectly for you. But this guy over here first.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I'm going to ask two questions.
Yes.
The first one is, what if I say that this guy is God? Yeah, for example. So how can we prove that this guy really exists? Maybe I'm dreaming, maybe he's not even here, maybe he's a projection of something. So how do we prove that he exists? It's up to me, I guess.
Yeah.
Is there a logical sequence that you go through to prove that he exists? Because he's just standing right here.
Yeah.
That's the first point. Yeah, the second point is the perfection of the island. I think the perfection is up to every specific person, because for me, I might not like coconuts. So another coconut doesn't mean it's perfect.
Yeah, put whatever you want on the island.
Yeah, or it could be the coconut that brings all the trees down because the weight is too much. So there could be a specific number to it. However, perfection, I think, is up to a certain person, because it might be a color. What's the perfect color? What's the perfect?
Yeah, I mean, again, this is where actually I think you're just sort of making the point I just made. On that second one, you're making the point I just made, basically, that this is a reason why the Gaunilo-style arguments don't work, is that the properties that go into making an island perfect are the kinds of things which are admit of no maximal, and people disagree about what kinds of things would make an island perfect, for example. When we talk about perfection in the context of the necessary being or God, the perfection is meant to be perfection qua being, right? So perfection insofar as a thing is a being, like an exemplar of a being that exists, right? In the island case, we're talking about the things that go into making a really good island, right? So it's just like a different notion of perfection being employed in both cases. Now, the existence, proving the existence of this guy, right? Look, yeah. So. Well, that is because he's a contingent being, right? I mean, he's a contingent being, physical being. The way you know how any of those things exist is through inductive argument and through experience. Arguments by experience and inductive arguments are always fallible, right? They're always fallible. So yeah, I mean, do you have a guarantee he's not like a cleverly disguised android or a hologram or something like that? No, you don't have a guarantee that's the case. But you can be pretty reasonably sure that he really exists because like that's the simplest overall empirical scheme of the universe, or because there's a really good inductive argument. I mean, it'd be somewhat. Okay, then you would find out all this was a dream after all. But like while you're in the dream, it's unreasonable for you to think you're dreaming. Okay, so yeah, I mean, like crazy people worry about stuff like that, right? And there's a reason why. It's because the rest of us just use inductive reasoning all the time. Even though, yeah, I mean, I accept that it's not valid, of course, but it's those are plausible arguments. They're arguments based on probability. When we're talking about so that's for contingent beings that we can sort of directly experience through our five senses, right? I know that he's there and that he exists because I can see him, right? And that's of course, as we just discussed, it's like I'm 99% sure, but okay, maybe he's a robot. In the case of this special case, we're referring to a being that can't not exist, right? So the way we know this thing exists is through a priori argument. In this case, an a priori argument. Right? So it's not a matter of having a plausible but defeasible argument for the existence of God or the perfect being or the necessary being. We rather have an a priori argument to show the thing must exist. There are, of course, probabilistic style arguments, probabilistic kinds of arguments that purport to show that God exists. Like the watchmaker analogy is the famous one, that the universe is, well put together and nice, just like a watch. The watches have they have watchmakers, therefore there must be a maker of the universe. Paley recognizes that this is at best a probabilistic argument, right? It just shows that there's a high degree of likelihood that there is a creator, right? But as Hume pointed out, of course, there are many, many, many problems with this particular argument. This one is a priori. It doesn't purport to show that God might exist. It purports to show that he necessarily exists. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah. Of course. Yeah, I mean, there's many reasons why that's a bad argument, but yeah. In the back here, I think actually here. Oh, yeah, you probably should come forward. Actually, I was going to say, well, okay, Dina, go ahead. Yeah. Up to the, can you put the mic up to your mouth a little bit more there?
He cannot mock and even mock women.
Who is he? Me?
I don't know your name.
No, I said, are you referring to me?
Yeah.
I didn't mock women. I said.
You mocked everything.
No.
Oh, I didn't take him to be trying to mock us. But I do take the point. We should be respectful. I agree. Yeah.
But I'm here, so I must comment.
Okay, good. Yeah.
Thank you.
This gentleman here with the hoodie and the beard, or sorry, sweater. I thought it was a hoodie.
The concept of possible worlds or alternative history, I think it's a bubble. It makes you circle around the truth, but you can never reach it. It allowed you a very dangerous thing, to derive necessity from possibility.
Yeah, I know, it's annoying.
It allowed you to derive necessity from possibility.
Yes.
This is very dangerous. I think is the opposite, which is the classical standard path, is to define necessity, to define the impossible, and the possible is the spectrum between these two. And so your starting point should be the necessity, not the possibility. This starts from the possibility to reach the necessity. This is very messy, I think.
Well, thanks. So the reason you don't want to start from the necessary stuff is that you want the arguments that are most plausible are the ones that begin from the weakest assumptions, right? So you want to have the weakest possible assumptions to get you the claims you want. If I start from assuming necessity, then people start to get, they gnash their teeth harder and pull their hair out, more so. But starting from this seemingly innocuous claim, right, that the being is possible, it's going to follow that the being does in fact exist. There's nothing illegitimate about, so you could be objecting to just the logic I'm using, and I mean, if that's the case, then you're rejecting sort of a well-established logical theory about the nature of possibility and necessity.
Yes, there's a concept of
okay,
possibility here, I think.
Okay, it's possible, yeah. I mean, it's possible. So look, there are many different modal logical systems, and I am picking a particular modal system. This modal system, I will sort of note, is the one which sort of the consensus of the philosophical community is that it best captures the intuitive notion of possibility in the broadest sense, by which we mean something is possible if it doesn't entail a contradiction. There are weaker forms of this, or there are other forms of possibility and necessity, like physical possibility and necessity, right? Of course, those things which are physically possible are logically possible, but not all the things which are logically possible are physically possible. And so there are different notions of possibility, of course, that are at play. But with this particular system, though, I mean, I'm just going to sort of stand on the system and say, this particular system of logic I'm using, this modal system, does in fact allow you to infer necessity from possibility in only specific circumstances and specific instances, namely, sorry, this is the animations. All right, namely, these cases. You can infer necessity from possibility only if the possibility we're talking about is a possible necessary truth, right? None of everything else. So this won't go for contingent truths. So if it's possible that, if it's possible that everyone in this room is a hologram, it doesn't follow that you are holograms from this because it's not a necessary truth.
I think the concept of possibility is a derivative of necessity. By this, you circle around yourself.
I don't think that's quite what I've done here. I mean, so what we're trying to do is just to... We can define possibility in terms of necessity if you would like.
We don't have another choice.
Actually, we could do that. I mean, so one thing we could do is like, theoretically, we could drop this, okay? And we could define possibility in terms of necessity if you would like.
That is the way.
Okay, well, we can definitely do that. And I think we can run the proof, we can still get the proof to go, even in that way. Because then what you do is you define the possible as that which is not necessarily true. Right?
Maybe,
yeah. And so, so I take the point, and certainly we could do that. Yeah.
Thank you.
Let's get someone who hasn't said something before. So in the back here. Yeah. Not his brother.
I just wanted to test the foundation of the argument itself. If I gave the example that the Big Bang Theory, which is highly plausible, is possible. The Big Bang Theory states that it is necessary that there is no supernatural intervention. Okay?
Does it say that?
But that's what it leads to, that there's no supernatural intervention, that the world is created by an atom. Yes, but it states that.
Okay. Go ahead and finish your question, but,
okay, the question is,
I mean, I think I'm going to end up agreeing with you
then
here. But,
if this is what, if it says that there's no supernatural intervention, then it means that necessarily a God does not exist, and it is highly plausible, therefore it is possible in a world. And if it's necessary that a God does not exist, therefore it's necessary in all words.
So if you can establish that, so no, it doesn't. It's not going to follow from. So the Big Bang theory is a physical theory, right? It's an empirical theory. It's a theory which purports to explain why the universe is the way it is, and this goes back to the sense of explanation that was being invoked here. So if you accept the Big Bang theory, then there is no reason to accept. You don't have to posit the existence of a God to explain the universe, although I think that you make a valid point, right? And then you sort of you have to ask this question about the singularity and et cetera, et cetera. But then again, you can talk about contracting universes and all this. The point, though, is this. When you say, as a proponent of the Big Bang theory, that it is not necessary to posit the existence of a God, this is not the same as saying that God is an impossible being, right? So from it is not necessary that P, it doesn't follow that P is impossible. It merely follows that it is possible that not P, right? So if I say it is not necessary that I don't know, it snowed in New Cairo today, or something like this. What I'm saying is that it is possible that it didn't snow in New Cairo today. I'm not asserting that it is impossible for it to snow in New Cairo today, right? And so you can accept the Big Bang theory and still accept the possibility of a necessary being, and then by the argument I just gave, the being exists. So that's what I want to say. I mean, think of it this way. That's an empirical argument. It is a claim. It is an argument that purports to explain why the universe is the way it is on physical principles that were derived from experience, experiment, observations, et cetera, right? I am proposing an a priori argument that shows that there is a necessary being. I don't think the two things are incompatible, but if it's true that if this argument is sound and that there is a necessary being, then it does show that the universe can't, strictly speak, that there had to have been something else around. Like the universe didn't just spring up out of nowhere. Would be I guess that would be something that would follow from this. But accepting the Big Bang theory does not entail that God doesn't exist. It just is. It would be one of these arguments that shows it is possible that he doesn't, or something like that. Is at most what you can infer from, I think, the Big Bang theory. Yes, I guess. So you could take an agnostic point on this. Yeah, I think that's right. A good way to put that.
You're using modal logic, etc. Now, the idea
Mm-hmm.
you described, or the one I'm talking about, what would you call it in philosophy? Something else besides modal logic?
Yeah, I mean, you probably use modal terms in there if you would like, but what you've got in mind is a kind of abductive argument, an abductive argument, an inference to the best explanation, or something like this. So, I mean, that's sort of what the Big Bang theory is going to be as well. It's an abductive argument. It's an inference to the best explanation. It's because of course you can't directly observe the Big Bang happening, but you can see things like cosmic background radiation, and you can say, well, were the Big Bang theory true, that would explain the existence of cosmic background radiation. So we infer the Big Bang theory is the case, or the universe is sort of expanding at the sort of the rate we would predict if the Big Bang theory were true. But that's empirical. Yasra, you want to pick somebody? Yeah.
I had a point.
Oh, you do? Okay. Yeah.
First, I think that this argument just proves that existence exists. Nothing else.
But necessarily so.
Exactly. The second thing is regarding the critiques to the argument.
Uh-huh.
There are a lot of valid critiques when it comes to logic. Uh-huh. But I think that some problems has to do with the historical understanding of a God, that the God should be a creator God, an all good, all powerful, and also an all knowing.
Yep.
And that is not connected to the argument. So the argument could stand if you just have to take off a lot of historical associations with a God.
Well,
but
I mean,
the history of the argument itself comes from a Christian tradition that hosts all these ideas of a God. That's
true.
The problem.
Yeah. I'm not really sure why it would be a problem. I mean, Again, I admit that the argument doesn't show that God exists in sort of a robust way. All that I'm trying to show is that there is a necessary being exists. Take that as you wish. You know, it's compatible with many different religious views, but it's a different argument, it seems to me. So it doesn't seem like it's a criticism of this argument so much as it is a different argument that people can have about, okay, given that there's a necessary being, what's it like? Right? That would be the next phase of the argument. Yeah, the gentleman in the vest. Then how about that? Oh, the hat. Sorry, the hat. I don't think he had a turn yet.
What if we use the argument